Hey listeners, I love making this podcast, and I think it's important work. I love sharing these conversations with you, but it takes time and money to make it happen. I need your help to keep making it and bringing you these conversations. Would you consider supporting this podcast with a monthly donation? Monthly supporters will receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits through Patreon. You can go to the website, wdtatpodcast.com, and click on support to make a donation or sign up for the Patreon. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. In this episode, I talked to C. Christopher Smith about what he has learned from over a decade of intentional conversations in his church, different ways to make our conversations better, and I solve the mystery of his first initial. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Chris Smith, pastor and editor of the Inglewood Review of Books, and he's also the author of How the Body of Christ Talks. I'm often jealous of people that have three names. This has come up in a previous interview with a friend of mine whose name is Ashley Bean Thornton, and I noticed that as an author, your name is C. Christopher Smith. And so I'm extra jealous of the initials because it doesn't work very well with my name. But what I really want to know is if the C stands for Christopher.
No, it doesn't.
Oh, okay.
So my parents wanted to give me my dad's name, but didn't want me to be confused with my dad. So I've always gone. My dad's name is Charles, so my first name is Charles.
Okay.
But I've always gone by my middle name so as to avoid confusion. And it also works pretty nicely because there's about 6.5 million Chris Smiths in the world.
That's true.
To be able to have a first initial with the name Christopher is a little more unique than Christopher and then whatever the middle initial would be.
Yeah, true. Okay, good. Well, mystery solved. All right, so thanks for being on the podcast. We can wrap up now, and I'll go home.
Yep.
And I'll work on my new initial that I'm gonna steal. No, I wanted to talk to you on this podcast. You know, a lot of what we talk about is how to have hard conversations, and you've written a book that's all about how the church has conversations and practices conversations, and so I thought it would be great to talk to you about it. First, I wanted to know a little bit about growing up and conflict. What was it like for you? I find that that's a really interesting question. We all kind of grow up learning different things about conflict, and sometimes we think everybody else grows up learning about conflict the same way as us, and then maybe we get married or we get to know people and find out, oh, your family dealt with conflict very differently than mine did. So for you growing up, what was conflict like, and what did you learn?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not one that I've been asked before, so I had to think a little bit about it. But I would say just as a general rule, conflict was something to be avoided in our home. There's lots of different reasons for that, some of which I think is kind of bad interpretations of Anabaptist theology that unintentionally probably give the benefit of the doubt there, unintentionally equates peace with the absence of conflict.
Right.
And there was also, without going into a lot of detail about it, there was also, I guess it'd be an unhealthy bit of anxiety in our household. And that also contributed to the desire to avoid conflict because it just kind of would exacerbate that anxiety in several of us.
So you said you grew up. Did you grow up Anabaptist?
Yes and no. That's part of an interesting part of my story. Both my mom grew up in a Mennonite community in southeastern Iowa, And both of my parents are graduates of Goshen College. But after college, my parents ended up in the D.C. area. And there wasn't a Mennonite church anywhere close to where we were at that time. So I was kind of very oddly raised in a Grace Brethren church, which, especially in the D.C. area at that time, was very God and country.
Interesting.
So I was taught a lot of kind of Anabaptist history and theology at home, because that's what my parents knew and that's what they wanted to gift to me. But I saw something very different in the church that I was growing up in, and it was interesting to, again, I don't know that it would ever have risen to the level of conflict. I don't think it ever did, but certainly there was tensions there between, and my parents would grumble sometimes about the ways that the church sang patriotic songs on around the 4th of July or Veterans Day or whatever. So it was an interesting experience. But as I've grown up, I've kind of I've never been part of any church in the Anabaptist tradition, but I've certainly kind of during college and after college, as I was kind of trying to figure out faith on my own terms, certainly strongly identified with the Anabaptist tradition.
Yeah, well, I went to a Baptist seminary in Texas, and then we joined a Mennonite church afterwards, and so I would always joke with people that I just added an Anna after I got finished with seminary, and so that's a joke for all the theology nerds that might listen to this podcast, I guess. But yeah, you mentioned, anxiety dealing with conflict definitely brings like a certain style approach to conflict. People avoid conflict by, deal with conflict by avoiding conflict. I tend to be a personality that deals with conflict by dominating it. And my wife is a little bit more along the lines of your family, and so we have this chase that happens in our marriage where I'm trying to chase down the conflict and she's running away from it. And so and I imagine that that's also the story in congregations under the surface, right? That those sorts of things are going on. So tell me a little bit about the story of your church and how the journey you guys made coming to this point, because in the book you talk a lot about your church making this journey to have better conversations. So tell me, how did you end up there? Was there a certain topic, or was it gradual and just experimenting? How did you guys end up working on this? Better conversations, yeah. That's
a great question. So to make a long story short, we kind of stumbled into the practice of conversation. We, in the early 1990s, like a lot of evangelical type churches, we had a Sunday evening service that was on the verge of dying off, just because the pace of life and whatever else, there wasn't really the demand in the congregation for it. But unlike a lot of other churches, we were weird in that we didn't want to give up being together on Sunday nights. We knew we couldn't continue to do the same old light version of the Sunday morning worship service that we had done for a decade or more before that. So somebody had the idea, why don't we circle up chairs in one of our multi-purpose rooms and start to have a conversation together? We didn't know what we were getting into. We didn't really do it with a lot of intentionality. I think there was a few maybe leaders in the church that had a sense that it was important that we learn to be able to talk together. And again, this was the early 90s. So basically pre-internet, certainly pre-social media. And I mention that specifically because we very rapidly realized that we didn't know how to talk together. It was quite a mess. People were sarcastic with each other. People even occasionally sometimes yelled at each other. A few people left the church altogether. Some people stayed part of the church but stopped participating on Sunday nights. So yeah, it was quite a mess. And we very rapidly came to the place that we realized we didn't know how to do this very well. That it was very, very difficult for us. But out of sheer stubbornness or whatever else, we kept at it week after week after week. So every Sunday night we get together and talk together, and that continued and continues to the present. About a couple years ago, we switched, and now we have our conversation immediately after our worship service on Sunday morning. But basically, it's still the same sort of thing. It's just a different time that we do it. And that allowed some of our older people in our congregation, that older people and other people that just, for whatever situation in life, didn't feel like they were able to come back on Sunday nights, allowed them to participate in the conversation because most of them were already there on Sunday mornings anyway. Yeah. So, but anyway, we've continued for almost 25 years now. Wow. And we do feel like we've gradually gotten better. And at some point along the way, we've done this a few times, so I've been part of the congregation here for 16 years now, a little over 16 years. And in the time that I've been here, so I haven't been here for the whole length of that conversation, but a pretty good chunk of it. And even a few times in the times that I've been here, we've taken some seasons to intentionally think about how can we talk better together, what is and isn't working, that sort of thing. And we've made intentional changes along the way as a result of some of those kind of more evaluative sorts of conversations.
Yeah, it sounds like your congregation in some ways has some similarities to our community in Waco, Texas, in that like we try things a lot of times, and we kind of say, well, we don't know if this is going to work or not, but but we're going to try it, and then we'll revisit it, and if it's not working, we'll try something else.
Sure.
And that's sort of the opposite of I think the stereotype of a congregation is that you got to argue about the color of the carpet and that nothing can ever change, right?
Yep. I think it's one of the benefits we talk about here a lot because we're an independent Christian church for the church history nerds out there, we're part of the Stone Campbell tradition or restoration movement, which is also part of the kind of larger free church tradition. But one of the benefits that we realize that we have in being congregationally autonomous, not part of a denomination, kind of a hierarchical sort of denomination, is that we do have that freedom to try things. And I would imagine, I don't know how intentional your congregation would have been about it, but Mennonites also, as free church congregations, have more latitude than some other traditions in experimenting with things. Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that we've learned in conversation, one of the lessons we've learned in conversation over the years related to this observation that you just made, was that in learning to talk together and learning to trust one another in conversation, I think that's kind of been one of the best fruits of our conversation. We haven't kind of come to magically agree with one another. We're still pretty theologically diverse, politically and ideologically diverse. But I think where we've seen the most progress is that we are growing to know one another, to trust one another. And I think one of the things that comes with knowing and trusting one another is that you're more open to trying things, to taking the sort of risks. You feel that you can take those sort of risks because you have at least a little bit of trust in one another, and you don't have to have everything figured out beforehand. That you're a little bit so many churches, particularly evangelical churches, and I would say probably this is true of a lot of mainline churches as well, in my experience, are kind of paralyzed to try new things unless they have it figured out, unless they're almost completely confident that they can do it well. Sort of perfectionism almost, that if we can't do something very well, then we don't need to be doing it. But I don't think that's a sort of healthy mentality. And I think being in conversation has been helpful for us in building up trust, but in kind of a sub fruit, as it were, of building up trust is being able to experiment and try new things. And so we've started half a dozen different businesses the Englewood Review of Books, the magazine that I'm the editor for, is kind of one example of that. A lot of different sort of initiatives here in our neighborhood, and Early Childhood Education Center and community and economic development work here in our neighborhood are all kind of initiatives that have started. And I don't know. I mean, again, it's pure speculation, but I'm inclined to believe that those sorts of things might not have been started if we didn't have practices of conversation that kind of gave us enough trust in one another to be able to take the sort of risks that starting a business inevitably will require.
Yeah. You have this great quote in the book where you say patience is a third way response. That's neither fight nor flight. And I really love that. And I think
that's
it's true.
Actually pretty much a paraphrase of Henri Nouwen.
Yeah.
But it's one that I deeply believe in, certainly relevant to conversation.
Yeah, and that the fight or flight seems to be, as you said, some people did leave your congregation, right. Or there's going to be like verbal fisticuffs. So how do we cultivate that patience? What are some of the things that you've noticed that helped people maybe get over that hump of feeling like, well, I either got to get out of here or I'm gonna like really go at it and try and defend myself? How do people find their way past that fight or flight?
Yeah, that's a good summary, I think, and a good question. I mean, I don't know that everybody always really would agree that they've gotten past that. I think there's a lot of us that in certain situations still kind of feel the fight sort of impulse fairly strongly, even though we're kind of committed to sticking around. It's still can be kind of petulant, but I mean, I think the biggest part of an answer to that question, though, is what I've already mentioned, and that's the role of trust, of trusting that God has gathered us for a reason, trusting that God is at work among us, even if we don't understand it, even if it doesn't completely always make sense, but trusting that the sort of unity that Jesus prayed for in John 17 is something that ultimately God wants to make manifest among us, and that in order to do so, I mean, realizing the various sorts of ways that we don't see eye to eye or don't, and again, I'm hesitant to use that language because I think it puts too much emphasis on kind of the orthodoxy, the right belief, right convictions. But there's ways that we don't always work harmoniously together. There's ways that we still have a long way to go in manifesting that sort of unity. But I think for me, and this is the central metaphor of the book for the listeners that haven't read it yet, the human body, I think, is a wonderful sort of example of diversity in unity, and the sort of also, it's a wonderful image of kind of maturing into that unity. When we're born, an infant doesn't know that her hands or her feet belong to her body. She can see them, but she doesn't realize that they're connected to her mind and that she can control them. And then, of course, gradually as that infant matures, she not only comes to the realization that they are connected together, but then ultimately all the parts of her body, hopefully, if she's healthy, will be able to learn to work together in conversation, of course, because that's the nature of how we've been created. But I think that's a really helpful sort of image that comes to mind that came to my mind when you asked that question. That, I mean, I think most of us are in the stage where we're at least toddlers, that we've kind of realized that we belong together. But we still have a long way to go in kind of learning to orchestrate our lives and our gifts and skills and talents and so forth to actually be a graceful and highly agile body together.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of churches maybe are kind of even stuck in the sort of phase of infancy, not even because of the pervasive culture of individualism.
Sure.
Are not even realizing that they belong to one another. Their members belong to one another. But even once you come to that realization, I think there's still a long road of learning to talk and to work together and to mature together, as the writer of Ephesians says, into the fullness of Christ.
Yeah, and I really like, that metaphor. It's a great biblical metaphor, but it also has a lot of interesting possibilities. And, my question that I posed to you was probably, maybe there's some flaws even in the question about, how do we get past fight or flight? Because as individuals, as we're growing and maturing, we also have to grow in our own sort of self-awareness, right? It's not that fight or flight leaves, I had moments today where I had those feelings of fight or flight and struggling with how to respond to different situations or different conversations that were going on. But the difference is, as we grow and mature, there becomes more of a self-awareness, and we begin to try and unpack and process our own, baggage and become healthier people. And
no doubt.
This continuing process of growing. And so similarly, it seems the congregations and communities, groups of people would go through that same process of sort of becoming self-aware that, these people aren't just individuals, but when we function together, we're this body, and now I can't do without those other people as easily as I thought I could before.
Right, no doubt.
There's it's almost there's a sentience that happens. There's this like consciousness kind of that can grow out of those better conversations, and I've certainly felt that, I think, in our community as well.
Yeah, and I think that one of the ways that I talk about the human body here and our belonging to church bodies and to other social bodies is that we're created, I think, created in the image of God, precisely that we are created to live and to function in social bodies, just as God is Trinity, three distinct, as the Christian tradition, whatever that is, I would have it, Christian theological tradition at least, three distinct persons, but yet united, and both the kind of threeness and oneness emphasized. I think our bodies, to some extent, maybe there's some problems where the metaphor breaks down, but some theologians that would kind of understand the Trinity in more social ways would talk about the ways that the persons of God indwell one another. And there's some it's an interesting thought experiment to take that notion of indwelling and think about the ways that the parts of our body indwell one another, and how meaningless a thumb is without all the sorts of muscles and tendons and bones that surround it, and nerves that not only comprise the thumb, but also that help the thumb to operate in conjunction with the body. So it's an interesting sort of way to think. Our bodies provide some very sort of visual language, visual ways to imagine the nature of the Trinity and the nature of the ways that we are created to live with other human beings.
That's excellent. One of the practices in our community in Waco is we're a bilingual community.
Oh, great.
And so we made a commitment from the beginning of that community to be bilingual not only for people that needed translation, but also as a practice. And
Sure.
what that means for us, and one of the things I've always really loved about that community and that practice is that it slows things way down.
Mm-hmm. No doubt.
And as someone who has a lot of thoughts and opinions and often is very eager to give my opinion and put things out there, it has always forced me to think more clearly about what I want to say and say it in smaller chunks. Mm-hmm. And I that's has been a really fabulous practice for our community. And another sort of similar aspect is using silence in conversations. I think as you're kind of talking about being able to things that can get us past the fight or flight and things that allow us to abide. You talk a lot about abiding also in the book, and
Mm-hmm.
I love that language. When we have to sit in silence, we realize sometimes we just need to be with each other. And it also can, we had a practice for a while during our teaching times of trying to intentionally have pauses in the middle of our discussions where especially those who were more introverted or needed more time to process or just didn't, weren't as eager to talk over someone else or interrupt or assert themselves forcefully into the conversation. What's been the role for you in silence, with silence, and then also dealing with introverts and extroverts and practices that have helped deal with some of those dynamics and conversations?
Sure. No, that's a great question. I certainly think, I guess I'll preface it by saying that, we still have a lot to learn. We probably have some people, myself included, that probably talk too much, and others that whose voices would be valuable if they, voices are valuable, period, but it would be beneficial to the body if they would contribute more. Yes. We do try not to let anyone hog the conversation. Sometimes because we're our conversation is open. Sometimes, especially when it was on Sunday nights, we would get somebody wandering in that wasn't a regular part of our conversation, but just looking for a worship service. And sometimes that sort of person would feel a need to kind of roll at length, sometimes in very kind of religious sort of language. And so sometimes gently we have to take someone aside or gently say that we do try to share the floor. And we haven't done as much. I would love for us to be a little bit more intentional about kind of doing what you suggested of taking a certain amount of pause between each person's. One thing that we have done in a more again, I don't know that everybody that participates in the conversation is kind of fully cognizant of this, but we do kind of bookend the conversation with prayer, and we really do try to enter into the conversation in a prayerful manner. I would say most of us in that. We realize that God is present with us. God is desiring to direct our conversations. It's not about kind of any of us personally winning out, as it were, but really to be in the spirit of prayer is to seek the reign of God together, and that the Holy Spirit in and among all of us is our guide and orients us in that direction if we would pay attention. So we talked a little bit about that. But I think one of the things that we've done that we've learned from a fellow community that also regularly practices conversation together. And we don't do this on a regular basis, but we have done it sometimes. And this church that we learned this from, they call it pulse checks. And that's just intentionally going around the room and asking everybody to weigh in or to say, I'm not ready to comment right now. But intentionally giving everybody And that certainly has the effect of slowing things down, and also reminding everybody that we want you to participate. You're a valuable part of this conversation. We want to hear from you if you are prepared and feel ready to speak. And so we've done that sometimes, particularly on sorts of things that we might be. So our conversation time, this is one thing I haven't said yet, but our conversation time, we very intentionally have said, is not a decision-making space. So we have business meetings and other sorts of spaces where we make decisions together, but we very intentionally said, and I think that the Sunday conversation is not a decision-making space. And I think that's taken some of the pressure off of it, which has been really helpful. But sometimes some of the conversations that we have, we realize are moving in the direction of a decision, that we know that we have a conversation because we realize at some point in the near future, we're going to have to make a decision, and we want to try to understand some of the dynamics that may be surrounding that decision that we're going to have to make. And so in some of those situations where we feel the weight of it because we know we're going to have to make a decision relatively soon. So that's a situation in which we might use a pulse check sometimes, just because we feel the weight of it and we think it's really important.
Yeah, I think that distinction that you're making between which spaces are decision-making spaces and which ones are a little looser and able to, we're just having a conversation, is very, very helpful, and something probably our community would learn a lot from. We make a lot of decisions. As good Mennonites, we make things way more complicated than it probably needs to be, but I'm
sure we do. I share that too.
We've done our versions of either consensus or discernment processes, and it gets really weighty, it gets really heavy.
Sure.
And we don't have those lighter spaces to enjoy good conversation with each other where there's less pressure about the decision. I will say, though, one practice that I was part of the committee that was sort of leading a discernment process at one point, and the book that we were using to help sort of frame the discernment process had this role for someone in the leadership that was helping facilitate the process to be a shepherd during the process or during the conversation. So it was this person whose their main role was to sort of keep looking around the circle, around the room, noticing, who had their arms crossed and who was kind of not speaking, who was dominating, kind of keeping an eye on people that really wanted to say something but weren't finding the room to say it, or, they're sort of shepherding the conversation. And I really liked that, both that image and then also being forced. As I said before, it's not my natural inclination, but being forced to practice that, be in that role, to say, I'm going to step back in this conversation and I'm going to be the person that's taking the temperature of the room, not trying to push an agenda or even give my opinion, but really looking to the health of others. And that's a hard practice, but it's a really, really good one. I found that.
Oh, yeah, helpful. Absolutely. Yeah, we haven't used the language of shepherd. I think it'd be interesting to think about kind of our experience, kind of in light of that sort of imagery. But we have basically had that role, which we've kind of borrowed a term from the business world called a facilitator, which, when done well, does precisely what you've described. Really, kicks things off, helps the conversation keep moving around, is paying attention to people's body language and participation in the conversation, and can kind of steer it a little bit, not in the direction of any particular opinion, but just steer it toward a healthy sort of participation together in the conversation. And so we had one person in our congregation that was the facilitator for probably the first 12 years or more, probably more than half of our conversation. And he did a really good job. But also for the reasons that you said, it didn't work well for him, especially because he was the only one that had that role and did it for such a long time. It was very difficult for him to both be a facilitator and also to participate in the conversation. Right. It was a product of one of our kind of meta conversations about kind of how do we talk better together. We came to realize that it'd probably be healthier for us to have a team of facilitators that could rotate, that would allow the people that aren't facilitating on any particular night to actually be participants, and then they could rotate the responsibility of facilitating, so that there wasn't one person that was kind of always facilitating, but that we had more people that were actually functioning in that facilitating role, and could also be maybe being a little bit more mindful of those dynamics, even when they weren't kind of officially the facilitator. But it also kind of freed up the person who had been our facilitator to actually be just a participant in the conversations and not having to feel like he was shouldering the burden of facilitation alone.
Right. But it does change. I think once you've spent time facilitating and shepherding a group and setting kind of your own agenda aside, then once you are back in the seat, just being a participant in the conversation, it does shift kind of how you see yourself in the conversation.
Oh yeah. No doubt.
I in my less healthy days, I can remember going to meetings in our community with a chip on my shoulder, kind of ready for, well, let's just see what happens. Let's just kind of cause trouble and I'm sorry, I was that guy, and I hopefully am not that guy anymore. But yeah, I mean, sometimes that's how you feel going into a situation, depending on your place in the community. But once you've had to really spend time listening better and doing that facilitating practice, it feels different sitting in the seat again.
Yeah, no doubt. I think there's a connection there, at least for us anyway, and the way that the practice of conversation has unfolded here, between that and what I was talking about earlier of kind of conversation as a sort of prayer, in that, I think you really well described, a facilitator or shepherd really tries to set aside his or her agenda. And I think we've really tried to cultivate a conversational sort of space in which we really do. I mean, certainly we can never completely set aside kind of our convictions and an agenda, but really trying to hold those a little bit more loosely, and really trying to discern together what God is doing among us, bringing among us. That's more important than the sort of convictions and agendas that we bring. Though sometimes those convictions and agendas may play an important role in kind of shaping the discernment of what the Spirit is doing, but they're never kind of fully equivalent. And I think there was where was that I was reading? Oh, it's a story in David Fitch's book. He talks about two people in a congregation that he was a part of that were in deep conflict with one another, and the church could never get these people to talk together because at least one of them, maybe both of them, I can't remember exactly, refused to recognize the possibility that they might be wrong. And I think that, I thought that was such a great illustration that, I mean, of course we have our convictions. Of course, we have our theologies and our rooting, in our understanding of what God is doing in the world. But I think we always have to be open to the possibility that at least some facet of the way that we imagine the world and our life within it might not be exactly what God intends. And I think that part of that is the nature of prayer and learning to. I think prayer is largely, oftentimes, so many folks think about prayer and pray for things that they want to see changed and transformed. But oftentimes, I think most powerfully, the transformation that comes in prayer is the ways that we personally are transformed as we allow God to change us and to become, to use Pauline language, become ambassadors of what God is doing in the world.
Mm-hmm. I had a interview with a friend of mine in which he described this idea of when other people don't agree or we have these ideas. His approach when someone disagreed with him was, I was asking him how he was able to have these kinds of conversations that he and I could have where we disagreed, but disagreed well and had interesting and good conversations. And he said his approach when somebody doesn't agree with him, he thinks to himself, there must be a lack of information. They must have some information that I don't have. Mm-hmm. And I had never heard anybody put it that way before, and it really struck me that it's curiosity, right? Rather than assuming, well, they just don't understand correctly, and let me correct them. It's what information does this person have? Am I missing something? Because I don't agree with that, but how interesting that they think differently, and I wonder why. What's behind that, and getting curious about it. Yeah,
definitely. I had a situation recently that was very similar to that. We're actually thinking of we're starting to plan possibly starting a podcast in conjunction with Englewood Review of Books, and I was talking with one of the other people that's going to help. We're talking about having the structure of the podcast largely being a panel conversation, and a panel conversation talking about a wide range of books. And kind of the question came up about how do we handle situations where there's a book that comes up that we would never read in a million years, or that we think is maybe not a helpful book. And my approach was, let's try to approach that appreciatively, and really with the sort of curiosity that you're describing of, not trying to belittle the person that might have recommended that particular book, but to ask them more about it. So what is it that can you tell me more about why you're fascinated by this book, or why you're excited by this book, and just kind of really dig in a little bit. So it's not exactly what your friend was saying, but driven by a similar sort of curiosity to really try to understand. And again, I think that kind of goes back to almost where we started, and that some of the best fruits of our practice of conversation here at Englewood over the last quarter century is that we're coming to know one another, and we're coming to understand one another, and in knowing and having a little bit better understanding of one another, we begin to trust one another, and have a little bit more imagination for how any one of us or any subset of us might act in a particular situation.
I have one more question that we could probably do an entire episode on, but it ties back into kind of where we started. You have this quote in the book about fragmentation, that the fragmentation of our lives into these different spheres of home, work, church, that they inhibit our capacity for conversation. I was interested that I think that's true, and I think it has to do the trust building that we were talking about in the beginning makes that very difficult when our lives are very separate and fragmented, and because that trust building, as you said before, takes time to happen. So what are some things maybe that your church has done or is doing to work on that, to combat that fragmentation, to find ways for their lives to overlap and intersect more?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would kind of preface it by saying, for us at least, for the reasons that we've kind of already alluded to, learning to talk together came first. And as we were learning to talk together, we've kind of really felt the sort of pull into a sort of thicker, more interconnected sort of life together. Probably one of the biggest manifestations of that is more people wanting to live in the neighborhood where the church is, live and share life together intentionally in this neighborhood. So 30 years ago, kind of not too long before we started the practice of conversation, probably about 3/4 or 80% of our congregation lived out in the suburbs somewhere or in another part of the city, lived at a fairly significant distance from the church building. And then there was a very small percentage of the congregation that still lived in the neighborhood at that point. But over the last 30 years, we've kind of flip-flopped. So now probably 3/4 of our congregation probably lives within like a 3 or 4 block radius of the church building. And then we still have folks that are driving in from other places, and we don't mandate that people live in the neighborhood, but people want to live in the neighborhood. They want to be, they see the life that is going on here, and they want to be a part of it. And so I think, that's part of it. Certainly proximity plays a key role in starting to break down those sorts of walls that we put up between kind of home and church and work life. And then certainly the fact that we've started a number of different businesses along the way as well also starts to break down some of those barriers about the ways that we imagine work. And again, we don't require that people work for one of the church's businesses. There's really good things that have come from people that work in other jobs. But because we have some of us that are fortunate enough to work here throughout the week, it's also given some imagination for more holistic ways that we can engage members who don't work in one of the church businesses throughout the week in the work that they do. So we have a number of people in the congregation that work for other groups in our neighborhood that we have partnerships with, and those partnerships have been facilitated and the conversations, as it were, with those partners have been certainly enhanced because we have members in our congregation that work for those organizations. I think that's just kind of one really sort of practical sort of image of kind of how the spheres of kind of home and work and church life are starting to break down. Again, we have pretty porous sort of boundaries between those things, and don't try to coerce people into living in the neighborhood or working for one of our businesses. And we certainly value those members of our congregation that don't live in the neighborhood or work in one of our businesses. But yeah, so there's an excerpt from the book that ran in the Christian Century. Readers, it shouldn't be hard for listeners who are listening to this to pull it up with a search engine. But I talk about in there some language that we use, kind of the distinction between a religious community and a real community. And both of those are sort of ideals. There's never any sort of actual congregation that's completely a religious community or completely a real community. We kind of all exist somewhere on the spectrum in between the two. But I think it's important. Another way of talking about this sort of shift where the kind of spheres of our life are starting to overlap and intersect with each other is to talk about the shift from being a purely religious community or a largely religious community that basically just does worship and maybe some other basic sort of religious activities together, but our real lives happen somewhere else. To really trying to understand ourselves as a community together holistically, or more holistically anyway. That communities have economies, they have ways that they share resources together. There's communities are embedded in all kinds of social and economic relationships, and to be more of what we call a real community is to be on that journey of learning how to belong to one another in more holistic sorts of ways. And again, I think an important part of conversation, and I'm sure that many of your listeners will appreciate this, but is that part of what's healthy about conversation, particularly conversation as a way to address conflict, is that done well, it's not coercive. It allows for imagination and interaction that isn't, hopefully, that can be less coercive. I mean, certainly there's a lot of ways that even in conversations, people use guilt and shame and to participate coercively. But hopefully we're moving, as we learn what it means to be faithful to the way of Jesus. We're learning to be in sorts of relationships that invite people, that healthfully compel people, persuade people, maybe that's a better, to deeper, more interconnected sort of faithfulness together. But always being mindful of the importance of it being voluntary.
Right.
But hopefully our experience has been, and I hope that this is the case for other church communities, is that people want to. There's the sort of life that we are able to share together is there's something attractive about it, and people are at least curious enough that they might want to start to gradually tiptoe into a deeper experience of that shared life.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. So it's probably about time to start wrapping up.
Sure.
And I like to wrap up with 3 things that we can both share. Something that we learned or were reminded of from the conversation, something that we can do and recommend to other people as an action step, and then something we want to share, a resource or a recommendation. And I will go first.
Okay.
Something I learned from just talking to you was this idea of making a better distinction in conversations between decision-making conversations and conversations as a practice that have less weight to them and are less pressure. And I really appreciated that, and I think that's a very helpful idea and thing to remember, but also to remember that dynamic between them. So my community maybe spends way too much time on the pressure, the heavy decision-making, discernment kind of conversations. Others maybe don't realize, we're having these conversations, but they're headed in a direction, and now how do we transition to making decisions? So that dynamic is really important. Something we can do that I try to practice, but am not always good at. I mean, I started a podcast because I do like to hear myself talk at least a little bit, is silence. This idea that making space both for other people, but also for that inner voice, for that voice of God, our own stillness, where we have to spend time kind of with ourselves. That is very difficult for probably most of us, but it's a really important practice. And it also, in conversation, since that's what we've been talking about, makes room for other people. So especially for my extrovert brothers and sisters out there, silence as a practice, both on your own to get used to your own stillness, but also in conversations to really make room for other people, and sometimes to kind of let go of the need to say something that some of us feel. Something that I want to share, obviously, is Chris's book. You should read How the Body of Christ Talks. There's some really great resources in the book, and maybe Chris will talk some about those on his turn. We've used World Cafe and Appreciative Inquiry in my community, and those are very helpful tools for how do you organize a conversation sometimes, or how do you, there's lots of really cool creative tools out there for helping you not have to reinvent the wheel, but also be able to have conversations that's not just sort of always framed or set up in the same way. Sometimes that kind of shakes loose some things when you can have different styles of conversation. I want to recommend one other thing related to silence. There's an excellent podcast called Encountering Silence that I really enjoy.
That sounds fascinating. I'm not familiar with that.
It's really excellent. They have lots of interesting interviews, everything, related to contemplative practices and people and all kinds of things like that. But just the idea of silence in our lives, and that silence has something to offer us that we're missing out on in the busy information age. Okay, Chris, what are 3 things, something we learned, something that we could do, and something you want to recommend?
Sure. So certainly something I learned and something that I'm going to be thinking about is the language of shepherd for what we have traditionally called facilitator here. I'd love to think a little bit more about kind of that sort of language and imagery for what the role that we have traditionally called facilitator here at Englewood. So that's something that I've learned, and that's something that I'll be thinking about. Something to do. I appreciate you asking. In some ways, I'm kind of agreeing with you, but more broadly, the question that you ask about the role of conversation in slowing down. I think one of the things that I talk about in the book is that conversation at its best and deepest level is, even though language is part of it, it's fundamentally about learning to be present with one another, to pay attention to one another. And you really have to slow down to do that. And what are the practices? I mean, you talked about silence. I mean, we spent a while talking about various sorts of practices that help us slow down in conversation. I think that's really important. I think it's really needed culturally. I think long histories of industrialization and hypermobility have really sped up the pace of our lives and really inhibited our ability to be present and to have meaningful conversations with those who come from different sort of backgrounds than we do. So I think slowing down is what I would kind of recommend as something to do or to do more of. And then very briefly, recommendations. I'm going to make 3, but I'll try to do them rapid fire here. 2 of them that relate to the book, since you kind of mentioned that. There is a conversation guide that goes along with the book. It's free and available through my author website, c-christopher-smith.com. And you can download it from there. And if you want to have a group of people in your church or in your neighborhood or whatever that would want to read the book together, hopefully this can be a good start to actually practicing conversation together. So that, and then also there's some resources in the back of the book. One of the appendices has a set of different sort of ground rules for conversation that different churches and other groups have put in place to help them have healthy conversations together. And I think that's a great sort of resource for groups that are wanting to begin having conversations. Ground rules are really important for kind of setting the tone of how we desire to talk together, what we think it takes for us to talk healthfully together, and to encourage a high degree of participation and all of those sorts of things. And then kind of one other resource to recommend that's not directly related to the book is, so I'm the editor for the magazine, the Englewood Review of Books, and we have a website, englewoodreview.org. Reading has been a really important part of our conversations. There's lots of ways. I could probably talk for another hour or more about the ways in which reading and reading broadly, reading lots of different sorts of things has really been fuel, as it were, for our conversations together, has helped us understand things more deeply, things that are going on in our neighborhood, socioeconomic things, historical things in our congregation or beyond. The Englewood Review of Books recommends a wide range of books, realizing kind of with an eye toward the ways that reading diversely can be beneficial to our conversations with our brothers and sisters, but also with our neighbors as well.
Yeah, I'll plug the Englewood Review of Books. Also, I'm on your email list, and I know I've bought many ebook that you put right in front of me that it's on sale, and it's like it's $1.99, and it looks very interesting, and I can't help myself. So it's both a recommendation,
I suppose, but
it's
but
both
it's
a
also
recommendation and a caution, a warning.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. Well, Chris, this has been so much fun, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, my
to
pleasure.
talk to
Thank
us.
you for the invitation to join you.
And thanks for the book and all the work that went into both, over a decade of sitting down and having the conversations with a group of people in your congregation, but then putting it into something that is really, really helpful, and I hope people will take time to check out.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today on We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Help us spread the word by sharing it on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the podcast by visiting our website at wdtatpodcast.com and clicking on support. You can make a one-time donation or consider becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. You'll receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits. Thanks for your support. We would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking Send Voicemail. Your voicemail could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?